want to take a moment to thank our sponsor, the Apple House. Tom and his staff at the Apple House in Terre Haute have just been amazing with helping my husband and I do all our landscape. This is where we go to get our seasonal pots, all our flowers for our garden, our front porch, all the things that make spring wonderful. To just experience their customer service is far and above. And I just thank you so much for your sponsorship, and you all just need to go to the Apple House and let them help you and tell them Pinpoint sent you. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode as we talk with one of my favorite people, Pastor Nick Strobel, about a subject that some of us really aren't that comfortable talking about: stewardship. What do we do with our time, talent, and treasure? It's a conversation that I feel like some of us really need to talk about, and a conversation that some of us sort of avoid. But we're going to talk about it today with Nick, and we're going to dive in. First, I want to introduce you to Nick. He is, I mentioned, a really good friend of mine and my husband, Kurt. He is the lead pastor at Roswell Community Church outside of Atlanta. And Nick is married to a lovely wife, Kaylee, and they have two sons and just a neat family all the way around. Well, Nick, as mentioned, is one of my favorite people because he was our former pastor, and he also helped me and mentored me when I wrote and published my book about the Ten Commandments. So he's got a lot of knowledge and wisdom, and I can't wait for us to have a conversation with him about our time, talent, and treasure. So with that said, Nick, welcome to Pinpoint. Thank you for
Thanks.
being
It'll be great to
here.
be here. Yeah.
Well, I don't know where we're going to start, but I do know where we're going to start. I just the concept of stewardship. This is something that I feel like, at least personally, has been attached to a connotation with some of us, myself admittedly, kind of negatively. Stewardship is like, oh, I have to give. The church just keeps asking me. So, from the pastor's point of view, will you just kind of share a couple of questions? One, what is stewardship? Two, why should we not look at it negatively? And three, why do you think that even happened, where we have even got that connotation attached to the word stewardship?
Yeah. I think that's a really good kind of starting place. So I think stewardship, probably a different way you could say that would be investment. How are you investing what God's given you? And I think that's even a pretty consistent kind of force behind how Jesus talks about it quite a bit in different parables. There's an idea of taking what you've been given and using it for a purpose.
Mm-hmm.
Which we do. I mean, I don't think stewardship is something that we decide to do. It's something that we're constantly doing. It's just how intentional are we being around stewardship, right? And so I think the idea of how we use what God's given us is super important, because otherwise we will follow a metric to invest what we have. Will
Mm-hmm.
it be an eternal metric or a temporary metric, I think is really the question, right? And so I think in terms of why it's uncomfortable, or maybe why there's a negative connotation around, I think there's maybe a few different reasons for that. It goes against the grain of culturally, I think it's not just here, but just for all time, like we want our stuff, right? Like
Right.
there's an allure to our stuff, and we don't really want to naturally let go of it and take our hands off it. I think that's a part of it.
Mm-hmm.
There's kind of that natural human resistance sometimes to generosity or being others centered. I think another part of it, though, is it hasn't always been talked about well in the church. And so, I mean,
Well, I'm glad you said that, not me.
and it's not even, it's interesting when you look even back to maybe to get some distance from where we are right now culturally. When you look at the medieval Roman Catholic Church, a lot of the places where that got weird were around power and money. And I think the same thing has really been true anytime the church has gotten more focused on power and money than it has the message and mission that God's given it. There's a wake of pretty significant damage. And so
Mm-hmm.
stewardship's tricky because it's this call to steward and give something to your money. And the natural reality is the church is going to be a distribution point and collection point for that money. And so when churches haven't talked about it well, either through guilt or shame, or they're just dishonest, or even some of the prosperity gospel stuff of, well, if you'll invest $10,000 in the church, God's going to give you back 20, which, God can beat the S&P. So why wouldn't you
Yeah.
trust him on that, right? And
Yeah.
so in
Good point.
fairness, I think there's a reasonable amount of cynicism around it. And, recently, just in the past 5 years, it seems like more and more stories have come out in the evangelical world in our country, of financial mismanagement. And to be honest with you, it's
Hmm.
not a church guy. It's actually a finance podcast I like a lot, called The Compound and Friends. The guy's name is Josh Brown. He's on NBC a lot. He's at Ritholtz Wealth Management, and he was talking to a retirement guy, and they were just talking about some of the corruption in the financial services industry. And I think this actually applies to the church too. Josh said that in some ways you can't blame some of the guys entirely for their shady behavior on the
Right.
entry level, because he said bad incentives lead to bad behavior. So if you take a young broker or financial advisor and say your incentive structure is tied to how many people you can get signed up for this crappy product, bad incentives are going to lead to bad behavior. And I think, unfortunately, with the church,
Wow.
plays into some of why money's not always talked about well,
Right.
because guys' income's tied off of that, right? And the second thing he said that I think is applicable as we go into this topic, because it's a two-way street. The church should call people to be generous, and people should be discerning about the churches that are asking them for money.
Right.
The second question is who gets paid and how.
Yeah.
And so, the extreme examples like righteous gemstone level stuff you see out there, guys with their private jets and congregation funded vacation homes, and just stuff that I think it would be fair to say borders on extravagance.
Yes.
It can be difficult. It can be difficult it can be difficult for the spiritual reality around money to jive with some of the way that it's treated, right? So,
Well, I agree with you. And I think that's why so many of us, as the congregant on the other side of it, have had a little confusion wrapped around that. I mean, we've had this misconception that, we're going to give God a percentage of our money. Like it's, first of all, it's ours.
right,
That's one thing to what you spoke of, but also just the investment piece and what the return is. I mean, I absolutely see that in the business world. Just on my other part of what I do professionally, it's all very performance driven, reward
right,
driven on, and you cannot have the right heart about that. It could just be, let me get the result, and that could be not really, doesn't feel good. So that's not how I like to operate. But to your point about the event, there was some evangelizing back. I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and I think there was that connotation, again, I use that word, attached to some of the evangelists that were living a life larger than so many of the people that they were asking to give. And it
yeah,
was the televangelists. And so I don't think we should have a broad brushstroke like it's all bad, but I think that because of that, it's sort of by default, we kind of had that broad brushstroke, or at least I did. I can admit personally
sure,
that I had that feeling. So when it came time, I can remember my mother telling me how important it was to tithe.
right,
I kind of was thinking, well, I had all these questions, and that's really what we're talking about now is, well, why? Well, how do you know that it's being well spent? And where's the line between, a pastor like yourself, you should have a home and a car. Do you have
yeah,
the nicest car on the market, the convertible multi-$100,000 Lamborghini, Bentley, whatever, or do you have a nice, you know, car? I mean, it's like you have to, I guess each person has to navigate what that is, but I think that for those of us, I've heard that cynicism you spoke to about.
right.
I've heard that from others, like, well, they just want our money, and but the pastor deserves a living as well. I mean, this is a lot of work, and I know from my stepfather being a tenured man of the cloth, I mean, it's a
Yeah.
lot of work and energy that you never are really off. You're always on.
Right. And Paul writes in the New Testament, hey, like you should pay the pastor. I mean, that's a paraphrase, but paying the pastor a living wage is a biblical concept. And it's tricky, right? Because money is a loaded issue. It's why Jesus talks about it a lot. And there are kind of those two misses, that you referred to, the miss of, we don't want to give the money at all, just rely on God. And then the miss of um, some of the less ethical kind of bad motivation behind guys asking for money. And so
Yeah.
I think it's easy to justify not doing something difficult, which is investing what God's given us because we see bad behavior, right? And so I think obedience and discernment can go hand in hand and take us to a place where we can steward with generosity well.
Hmm. Well, and to that point, I think the generosity and stewarding, you talked earlier about the gifts that we were given and the grace that has been bestowed upon us to have the gift in the first place. So that ties into our treasure
Sure.
and our time,
Right.
obviously our talent too. You know, as how we're going to use these gifts and and spread the word and be relevant in the kingdom. And I think that we taking it back to the word stewardship, I think it's just attached to the money piece. It's not, which is another one whole conversation. But then when
Sure.
you have the conversation too that you can't forget is the time, which is huge. And then, our treasure, which can also be, our gift, so to speak. And so I feel, as a matter of fact, our pastor just recently spoke about how if you're not being a good steward of your gift that you've been blessed with, it can be frustrating to the Lord. It can be frustrating grace, really, because you're not doing with what you have, what you were asked to do. So, do you feel like that could, I don't know, maybe be sinful because you're not really doing what you're asked to do to be a good steward of what he's given you? And that's not just abundant money or wealth, but your gifts.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think there's a little bit of a balance here with grace and truth. And so I think people are going to have different seasons and phases of their life where maybe they're more or less obedient, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
if we're struggling to do that, we want to balance grace and truth together and say that in our imperfections, we do have the strength of Christ and there's forgiveness for sins, but there's also a call to try to be an obedient follower. And so, Jesus talks about the parable of the workers who were given different talents, and the guy just buried his in the ground, and he's like, "Hey, you wicked evil servant, right? You didn't do anything.
Mm-hmm.
You could have put it in the
Mm-hmm.
bank and it got interest on it." And so I
Mm-hmm.
think
Yep.
really the heart behind that is that we should be using whatever we've been given to fulfill the call that God's put on our life. And as Christians, it's to be Christ followers and to expand the kingdom of God, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so um, you know, what has he given us? What are those talents? Money is a part of that. I mean, you can't really get around like what are we doing with the money? But it's also wider than that too, of like what are we doing with our life as well, I think is an accurate way to look at that to be sure.
Well, and that brings up the point, and you and I spoke about this not long ago too, but when you think about the time, because it can be, that's something that you have to do with what you choose. I mean, it's your will to do with it what you want to. So, what we do with our time is usually out of order, or oftentimes, again, I'm going to speak for myself, but our time is often out of order with what the Lord is asking of us to do. And I'm trying to remember the scripture. I think I have it written down. I'm going to look and see because I think I did write it down, but it's the one about Moses. Where let me see if I have it because I'm pretty sure I do. Yes, Psalm 90:12. I'm going to read it. So teach us to number our days that we may present a heart of wisdom. So when I read that, I think about, okay, well, God's telling us to number our days are numbered. So do we really think about that? I know I don't. I'm thinking about it more and more in recent years, not about my mortality, like, oh, my life's going to be over soon. What am I going to do with it for me and my flesh? I'm thinking about it now. I'm grateful that the Lord's convicted me, and I'm realizing I do have some gifts. He is asking me, I'm here for him, not me. and he's using me. He doesn't need me. He can do whatever he needs without me, without you, without any of us. He doesn't need us. He wants us to be in partnership with him. So, what am I going to do with my time? And am I going to scroll on social media? Am I going to watch a bunch of TV? I don't think there's anything wrong with doing those things. But if we look at the culmination of our day and we're spending way more time doing that than talking to a friend, a neighbor, doing something for the kingdom, growing in relationship with him, being in nature, what have you. I mean, do you find that to be kind of a slippery slope?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, even pastorally here, it's interesting. We have a number of young families in our congregation in North Atlanta Metro. It's probably a lot like the area we're in, but it'd be pretty similar to where you lived when you were in Dallas.
Yeah.
Just a lot of pressure around performance, a lot of
Mm,
pressure around
hmm.
how you're succeeding and who you are. And I think we're going to probably get into this a little bit around this idea of treasure, but
Yeah.
I think at the end of the day, where the time, talent, and money all come together is really about our ultimate desires. And so ultimately, like what's driving how we use our time, it's always going to be driven by our deeper, probably ultimate desires around what we believe around salvation, where it's found, in a very practical way. Not the, oh, Jesus, but like, so for example, I think some of the challenges that we have as we talk, with our young families, I didn't include us in that, at least hopefully for a few more years.
Yes. To me, you're still a young family.
And so, we just got done with our youngest is done with elementary school. And so we now are going into a season of middle school and high school. And I'll tell you, February through May was insane in our house because our oldest goes to a magnet school, because he wanted to do the program they had there across town. It's like a 45-minute drive.
Mm. And that's a
So during golf
commitment of your time. Yeah.
So during golf season, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, he has practice at a course by the school. So one of us is driving to take him, which by the way, when it's my turn, it's not as big of a sacrifice. When Kaylee, she's stuck at a golf course for 2 hours. I'm stuck at a golf course for 2 hours. I'm like, oh, I'll do this for the kids, right?
Yeah.
It's a lot
Yeah.
harder for her.
With your golf
Uh,
clubs.
yeah, they happen to sometimes make it. It's
Yeah, your
weird.
your your putter happens to end up with your in your hand on the
Right.
green, on the
Yeah,
putting
yeah,
green.
exactly.
Yeah.
And so one of us is doing that, with Ethan. Simultaneously, Sawyer had soccer practice, by Atlanta Country Club, which is like, I mean, those two places are two different directions from our house,
Hmm.
opposite sides of Cobb County. And so we're constantly running kids places. And
I've
it's
lived that life. Yes, I have.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And the thing that's crazy about it is you want your kids to play sports. It was tough for us to get Ethan to Wednesday night church all the time during golf season. Sawyer wasn't in youth group yet, but the reality is, how do you do that? Or something that we've talked about. Sawyer
Hmm.
is our kid that wants to try everything. And
Yeah.
so what's difficult about that is you can't casually do youth sports. Everything is travel, elite, select,
So
whatever.
ridiculous. Yeah.
So like his rec soccer team is doing two practices a week. It's rec soccer. We don't even keep score. Like, why are we
Yeah.
so there's this trap we fall into without, like, there's not a sinful desire to have our kid in sports. It's good for our kids to play sports, but there's this system that we're put into that's evolved largely around money, this cottage industry of kids sports and performance and the travel team sticker on your car and just, the whole status part of it,
Yeah.
that we almost feel like if we aren't doing that, we're failing our kids. And so we get sucked into this thing with our time that almost feels like, well, shoot, how am I supposed to balance all this stuff? And we feel pulled. Or I mean, Ethan, when he was in middle school, was saying, I can't remember what it was. I think it was like some eighth grade orientation thing.
Yeah.
And he said one of his friends can't come because he's taking a PSAT prep class in seventh grade. It's like,
Uh-huh.
I didn't even
Yeah.
know what SAT was in seventh grade,
Yeah.
which is,
I don't think we ever even took those as far as I know. I think my mom said you're going to take the
right.
ACT. I believe, a junior in high school. Like it was not a big
Yeah.
deal. And I've managed to make it through life. And, I may not have been the most, intelligent person, but I certainly, I think made my way. And
Hmm.
I agree with you, Nick. I mean, I've spoken with this before on a former podcast, with a friend of mine here in town, and I definitely have had this sentiment, with my own children who were in competitive travel soccer. My oldest Dawson, I mean, we did the whole nationals and Disney and all the things. And my child Walker did high school football in Texas, which is like super intense. It's like travel, but
Yeah.
it's everything's about football, and it was awesome. And they both had great experiences. My daughter was a competitive cheerleader, a high school cheerleader. Their experiences, because it was more around the high school, was not as intense with the travel.
Sure.
But all that being said, there is a lot of time to that, and I completely understand what you're saying about, you know, if you don't do it,
Yeah.
well, then will your child be penalized? Well, there's the threat of that, and you're it's so difficult as a parent to say no. We're going to set the boundary for our home, and we're not going to subscribe to that, and it's going to be okay. But then your child might be, you're like, well, you don't really know. And I think that if your child's good enough, you're exempt from that,
You're
and
right about that.
that unspoken rule. So that makes it even more upsetting and challenging as a parent. But ultimately, yeah, I mean, we're in the world, and having to navigate that with time is challenging, because I don't think we want to be legalistic about it and be like, well, we can't
That's right.
ever miss anything.
That's right.
But we also need to make sure our heart is right, our priorities are right. And so it brings up such a good point about our busyness, whether it's being busy with families. Some of us are like, I'm beyond that in my life, but I don't know how I'm so busy, but I am. And so even to say I'm busy, it's almost like the 11th commandment, thou shalt not be so busy, because it's
Yeah.
like, I mean, honestly, when it all comes down to it, that really isn't going to matter and get me into the kingdom. I'm not going to have a better seat or, place in the kingdom because of how busy I was here running myself ragged for
Yes.
something that has nothing to do with the Lord. So I think it's a real important conversation to ask ourselves is, how do we prioritize our time and our talent and our treasure? And why are we not talking about that more than just like the money piece? Because it's more than just that.
Well, I think a good diagnostic question for all of us would be, what is the way that we're spending our time communicating about what we value? Because we do make time for what's
Mhm.
important, right?
That's
Like you
such a
do.
good point. Yeah, that's such a good point. And I think being good stewards is definitely biblical. And reading from First Peter, I think this is so important, because I always just, you know, this conversation is not just our opinion. I mean, this is based off biblical truth. And
Right.
I think in First Peter states, as good stewards of the manifold grace of God, each of you should use whatever gift he has received to serve one another, faithfully administering God's grace in its various forms. So we are to use our gifts, we are to use our time, and we are to use our treasure, just like you mentioned earlier about the parable of the talents. And I think that kind of just overall is telling us, this is not Old Testament. This is still relevant, and we are called to do that. And I want to just go back to something that we touched on earlier with the money. Um, so tithing. Again, I tithe, but I have
Sure.
to say, and I'm going to say to my audience, I haven't always tithed. And I may have mentioned earlier that my mom, she encouraged me to, but I was the one that was saying, well, I can't afford to tithe. I can't afford it. I cannot pay my bills. I mean, there was a season in my life that I really could not pay my bills. I mean, it was really struggling for our family. And so I think that there's so many of us that feel that way. Do you? Well, and I will say, once I started tithing, I realized I could still live my
Right.
life, and I was blessed abundantly, and basically did not miss the money. But one thing, I think, for those people that may be listening that aren't tithing yet, do you recommend pastorally that you just start at 10%? Is that still what the word? I mean, do you believe that's still important to be at 10%, or do you feel like it can be start at 1%, work your way up? Or is there some sort of um, reason? I mean, I'm just asking you that you should just
Sure.
start at 10% and just do it, just jump in and go.
So I think Pastorally, I would not say that 10% is the starting place. That's not what I would say. And so I think there's a couple of different realities that we got to latch onto simultaneously here as we talk about this. So number one, God doesn't love you less if you're not tithing. I think it's really important for people to hear that.
I do too.
I think so much guilt and shame goes around that, right? Like it's because so much of it's about our heart. It's not about our checkbook.
Yeah,
God
that's such a good point. It's such a good
doesn't need
point.
our money. And so this idea of like, well, if I'm not tithing, I'm somehow less than, that's not true. We have this sufficiency of our identity and sanctification in the work of Jesus Christ. And so
Mhm.
tithing isn't going to make God love you less. Now, does he want it for us? For sure he does, but it's because ultimately tithing is, I would even say to go higher, generosity with our money is an antidote to the disease of more, that just more is better. We got to always have more. And going all the way back to the Old Testament, which is really where it originates, 10% was basically what you would set aside to sacrifice to the Lord. And there was this rhythm of setting aside. For the Lord, there was a rhythm of setting aside some of your fields for the poor to be able to glean. There were these checks on being consumed by this quest for more, just constantly more, 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 more. And so generosity is a check against that false idol of, well, if I just have more, then I'll be saved and sufficient. And so 10% is an Old Testament concept. I don't think it's bad to tithe 10%. I think it's a really good baseline idea.
Mhm.
But the New Testament doesn't mandate that. Actually, Jesus says give everything, right? Like he says give 100%. Uh,
Yeah,
so
you said it. Yeah.
so really the idea is what does radical generosity look like? The New Testament doesn't put
Mhm.
a percentage on that. I think the church is kind of historically anchored at 10 because it's in the Old Testament. I think it's a round number. There are a lot of historic reasons for it, and I don't think it's bad or wrong.
Mhm.
Uh, I think that's a really good target goal. But to say if you're not giving 10%, you're a sinner, I would not feel comfortable saying that.
Well, I agree with you. That was why I asked the question because I was curious what, again, pastorally, how you feel about that. And I do think there's a lot of reasons to believe that you kind of touched on, like, well, if I'm not doing it, am I falling short, or
Yeah.
is this why I'm not being blessed? Is this why I'm not moving forward in my career, or my personal
Right.
life is struggling, or is it a punishment? And I think it's really important that you cleared that up, because or said that, because I do feel like that we don't want to make it about works and our actions without the right heart and ability. And to your point too, we're supposed to leave it all, let it all stay there and follow him, leave it all behind. And so I definitely feel like that was such a powerful statement you made about, 100%. So I just love that. So, okay. Well, Nick, I just want to ask you if there's anything on this whole subject of time, talent, and treasure that we haven't talked about as we're wrapping up, that you may have said everything that's come to mind, but if there's something that you haven't shared that is important that you want to, please go ahead. I'm putting you on the spot.
No, I mean, I think for me, it does come down to, and we talked about Matthew 6 when Jesus is where your treasure is, there your heart's going to be. I mean, really, he
Mhm.
is. He's talking about money for sure in that. But I think money is a symbol of a lot of other places of security we're finding. He's talking about basically the imagery in that statement is they buried the money in the box, right? Hide it in the field. And that was, kind of he said, "Hey, don't focus on building and setting aside money because it's not a reliable form of security."
Mhm.
So whether it's your time, what I mean, because at some point those three things you talked about, time, gifts, money, are all tied together pretty tightly and always have been. And so I think when we're talking about stewardship, ultimately what we're asking ourselves is where are we ultimately finding our anchoring and security?
Mhm.
And one of the benefits of generosity is it divorces us from that allure of salvation being found in prosperity in our stuff. And that's difficult to do because it's very alluring, right? I mean, I was telling you, we live North Atlanta is an incredibly affluent place. One of the places I like to run, Columns Drive, because it's flat. It's very hilly here. I'm not a good runner, so flat is good for me. It's by the Chattahoochee River. It runs in front of Atlanta Country Club. I mean, just massive houses. So think Highland Park.
Okay.
And it's beautiful and it's set off. There's no cars. You can run without worrying about being hit. The river's right there. in that amount of prosperity, when you run, you can almost, when you're in it, you do almost feel like a spiritual tug towards that. Like there is a
Yeah.
real power
Mm.
in the allure of, hey, this is going to save you. If we can just be rich enough and comfortable enough, then we're going to be complete and find salvation. Really, the act of stewardship is I think a concrete rejection and reaction against that lie.
Right.
We want to remind ourselves that while those things are good, and it's not bad if God's blessed us with success and money, it doesn't mean that we're evil, right? It just, when we're generous, I think it's just a reminder that that's not where our ultimate security and salvation can be found. And when we give away, I think it removes our hands from some of those idols and places of control and roots us back in what Jesus is talking about is the eternal, right? The kingdom of God.
Mm.
And ultimately, that's where our identity and security is found. And so all of this stewardship is ultimately about rooting our desires in the kingdom of God, rooting our desires in those places of ultimate salvation, right?
Mm.
That's the force. It's less about a number. It's more about your heart and your identity.
Mm. Hallelujah to that. That is so well said, Nick, and a perfect place for us to close this episode. And I just thank you so much for your wisdom and your thoughts and your perspective. And I just appreciate that so much and that you shared that with us today on Pinpoint. And I do close each episode with a pearl of wisdom. And on this particular subject, one of the things that I really think is important is to take note of what Nick said. I'm going to just add that your treasure is where your heart is. So to kind of check that, just to know that if you are going to give, I think it's important to give to your storehouse if you're not already giving to your church, because I personally can vouch for the fact, and I heard it before I started doing it, and it is true that when you are giving, it feels good when you know that I'm not doing this for myself. I'm doing this for the kingdom because the people that I'm giving it to the storehouse because they're blessing me and I'm receiving from that. It's a wonderful thing. But the other pearl of wisdom I want to impart is that if you've never taken a gifts like a test, one of those survey type tests about your spiritual gifts, to know what that is, I really, really recommend you do that because maybe you aren't sure what is what is your talent or treasure rather. Where should you be spending your time that is fulfilling what the Lord wants you to do for him in the kingdom? And it can be overwhelming, and I've told this story before, where my husband has such a heart to feed the hungry. And I think that's so important and so wonderful. And I'm definitely wanting to contribute to that. But that's not where I have felt pulled. So for a long time in the body of Christ, I felt less than, like, what's wrong with me? And then I realized I am a different part of the body. That's the part of the body where my husband Kurt thrives, where his gift to give. And that was so important for his particular gift. And for me, I have others. One of them is exhortation. So, uplifting and influencing and encouraging, which hopefully I'm doing here through this podcast. But I feel like the Lord gives each one of those gifts, or gives us each gifts that He gives those to us as a blessing to magnify Him and glorify Him. And so I would encourage you to take one of those tests to just see where you naturally fall. It probably won't surprise you once you get the results, that it's already something in you that you feel. You just don't really know how to navigate that. So that would be my advice and my pearl of wisdom. And we'll put a quiz, a survey for you in the show notes at the end of this episode. So thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Pinpoint.